Same Ontario government leads to same Toronto housing crisis. Yeah, I don't think anything's going to change. Stay tuned to find out exactly what I mean. Promise you, you'll be worth it. Good day, Toronto. Welcome to another episode of Prime Properties TV. So glad you joined me here today. We are finally going to discuss the election because so much stuff has happened in the last week and a half or so. I finally got around to talking about it, right? So I'm going to give you kind of my feedback and all the reactions of, what the housing platform was for the Conservative government that just won. And like I said in the earlier part of this video, not really impressed. When I saw the platforms they're running, I don't really think it's going to amount to anything, but here, let me give you my feedback. So article number 1, here we got 5 things Doug's Ford election might mean for housing. Perfect, exactly what we're going to talk about, right? So the first one here I just want to highlight is that with the election, we saw a resounding support for the government to commit to building 1.5 million more homes in the next 10 years or 150,000. So for the record, we're already building at record rates. I don't think we're building fast enough, but just because they say, hey, we're going to do it, doesn't mean they're going to do it, because I'm pretty sure I made fun of Justin Trudeau for running for Prime Minister, and he was supposed to build a lot of affordable housing, but he doubled prices. And I think even under Ford's kind of reign, same thing, right? So I'm pretty neutral in either or. I would say I'm a little bit more conservative because I'm a little more of a capitalist, free market style. But at the end of the day, I think both of them are going to do a terrible job with the housing crisis that we have in Toronto, right? But the first thing that I'm going to mention is that exclusionary zoning. So for anyone that doesn't know what this is, it's a more fancy lingo, but it basically says that if you ever go and to look at the zoning in Bridle Path, and this is like the really bougie area, expensive area that everyone knows, right? So you actually can't build a house there unless the frontage is a minimum 60 feet. So that's kind of like the reform of saying, hey, look, unless you're rich enough to own a 60-foot lot here and build something, you can't afford to build here. So that's exclusionary zoning. It's saying you can't do anything here because there are rules around this neighborhood. So we've talked a lot about this, and I did applaud the PC government for having that housing task force thingamajiggy with the 55-pager. I'll put a link. It was probably in April or May, I think. No, maybe February, right? And it was great that they were going to end exclusionary zoning. That's kind of what they were promising, right? But I actually don't think they're going to be able to do it because you have a lot of pushback from cities who are going to be like, no, you can't do it, right? So this is exactly what I highlighted here, where it says, but Housing Minister Steve Clark says towns and cities aren't ready to change the zoning. And the reason this happens is because, so you have to remember, there are MPPs in different wards that kind of stamp these permits and whatnot. And they're the ones that ultimately have to answer to the people that live in that area. And if the people in that area don't want in density, which is the whole NIMBY, not in my backyard, then obviously they're going to have to appease these people who live in that area that vote for the MPPs. And that's kind of what the problem is. Unless the provincial government comes in and be like, bam, shut it down, all this done, I think it's still going to happen, right? So you see this a lot in the Rosedale area, obviously the Bridle Path, right? Anywhere there's a lot of detached homes, people kind of always fight tooth and nail. They go to all these meetings and saying that, hey, look, we don't want this density stuff, right? We're like, oh, at a certain time, this new fourplex, 4-story high, it's going to cast a little bit of a shadow on my backyard, right? So these are the things that actually go on that kind of delay a lot of the kind of upzoning of these properties so that we can bring, a little bit more affordability to the housing crisis. But like I said, I don't think it's going to be answered. Now, they did say that they're going to kind of penalize cities for not expediting it. But regardless, whether you expedite, if the answer is still going to be no, because a lot of people are shutting it down, it's still not being built. That's kind of my gripe with kind of the whole housing thing. The NIMBYism is really, really, really bad. Then we got the next one, minister zoning orders. So these are actually great. He's been using them for quite a bit, which is basically the Ontario government is coming and be like, hey, look, this is an area, we have to upzone it, I don't care, peace. They need to do this to all the other neighborhoods, right? And I think they're gonna get a lot of flack for it, but it makes sense doing these MZOs, and they've done it before in kind of high density areas, right? So the latest one, if you haven't caught on it, was that they approved these massive towers at Richmond Hill where the new station is supposed to go for the Yonge extension going north, right? So at Langstaff, at Yonge and Highway 7. So there's going to be tons of condos being built there, and it just went right past the permitting process because they're like, yep, this makes sense. High density, a lot of subway stations coming. We have to do high density, lots of units here, and it makes total sense. The problem in kind of doing this is right here. So the uneven application of MZOs and reliance on them as a tool for overriding municipal government decision is poor substitute for good planning. So yes, I agree, because if you overdo it to bring in housing supply, it's kind of like, hey, we don't care about all the other surrounding things. Let's just get some density in here. And while I do kind of agree with this, if I had to kind of give my side. I actually just prefer, let's just get some housing in here to help all the people with the housing crisis that we have right now. Whether we overdo a little bit or it's a little bit too high, you know what? People have no homes. I think that's the bigger problem. And that's kind of where I stand in these situations. Then you got the next one, skilled labor. I've talked about this before. Again, in a different video, there was strikes about carpenters and everything, right? So now they're saying that there is a shortage of tradespeople that threatens the plan of even building. So if we want to build even 1.5 million homes in the next 10 years, we don't have the people to do so. And this is the problem. Everyone, kind of like my generation and even anyone younger, and I'm like a millennial, just on the border edge, right? Not to disclose my age. But the idea is that everyone's like, hey, go to school, get good grades. And that's kind of what we was always taught, because we were taught to have a white collar job because they're cushy and you stay in the office, right? The problem is everyone has a degree and there's plenty of those jobs, but nobody wants to take the blue collar jobs where you're working with your hands, which actually is quite satisfying if you actually think about it. And a lot of people I know who work in the trades, right? They make way more money than people who are white collar. So we need to kind of stay away from the stigma of saying anyone who works with their hands is not smart, not educated. Because a lot of the trades I know, they make like over $100,000, whereas someone who went to school for 4 years, right, and they come up with a bachelor's degree, and trust me, I've seen all the people with bachelor's degree even applying for our assistant roles that weren't qualified. There's just so many of them, and they are starting at like minimum wage, 40, 50. If you're in the STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math, maybe you're starting at 60. Or you could just take the blue collar route. You go for apprenticeship and you follow, a master for 2 years. You're licensed, right? And you're at $100,000 right off the bat. Who's going to come out ahead, right? See what I mean? So we got to get over the stigma of like blue collar is not, a good type of job, because it really is, because there's a demand for it. That's why it pays so well. And the other thing that you kind of add on to all this problem is that like all the blue collar workers I know, they're actually like all a bit on the older side. They're all like 50, 60, who's really, really good, right? And they're all about to retire very soon. And like this is very kind of like blown out of proportion in the masonry, right? Like people who do brick, there's nobody who knows how to do that. They're really hard to come by. You ever try to brick a house? Oh my goodness, it's just ridiculous, right? So we have a skilled labor shortage, and I think we need to change as a society the stigma around working with our hands, because we need to build stuff rather than just like push paper. Yeah. Then you got the next one, transit-oriented communities. So we kind of talked about this. They're going to just plop a whole bunch of like density around these areas. I'm all for it. I like that. So the thing about doing all of this is high density generally means that they're going to be building a lot more high-rise condos and apartments, right, in those areas. So while yes, that's providing a lot of units, but the units that are being built, they're still very small, right? So if you're, call it $1,000 a foot, for you to get a 500 square feet unit, you're still $500,000, which somewhat affordable depending on what kind of income you have, right? But if you want to raise a family there and you need at least 800, call it 2-bedroom, which is still kind of on the small side for some people, then you're looking at $800,000, which is a little bit more difficult to be in reach, right? And that's kind of on the lower side on a price per foot. So if you're going to stack a lot of density around transit, it's great, but you need to have larger units that are more affordable for families to start. And this is why like the missing middle makes a lot of sense, right? If you have a piece of land, you can plop like a coach house on the back, or like a garden suite, or like a laneway home. There's actually more economics in that, because you don't have as much red tape, and the cost is a little bit lower than if you were to build a high density structure, right? So I think I agree with this, but we need some more kind of ground level housing for a lot of families. And then you got here the streamlined development, similar to what I was saying earlier, right? So it says the zoning has been approved. A lot of developers can walk in and get their stuff, right? So yes, all of that is there, but the problem is when you mix in the skilled labor and the fact that the market's slowing down, builders still need to make that profit, and they're not going to launch unless they make some profit. And that's kind of the problem. So even if there's a builder who kind of has it all zoned and ready to go, if the market conditions aren't good for them to sell at the price they need for profits, they're not going to. They're going to land bank it and sit on it for a while, right? So that's why there's a lot of kind of sites that are all zoned and ready to go, but they're not really selling them right now because the sentiment right now is really, really weak, right? So a lot of the builders are just like, you know what, I'm just going to wait. I may not get the price I want. So rather than relaunch and be like this weird double platinum launch, all that crap with like pre-con, then they're like, you know what, let's just wait it out, because they've already have it zoned. They're carrying it already. And if they can sustain that carry, they might as well wait a little bit. And it's the same thing with sellers, right? If you own the house, you don't need to sell it. You're going to get less money. Why are you selling it now? Same thing applies to the builders, right? So this is the type of real estate content you enjoy. Make sure to help us spread the knowledge by smashing that like button and subscribing to the Prime Properties channel, because every single week we put awesome content like this and I react to really weird things that people send me or just stuff I dig up myself, so that I can give you an idea of what's happening in the real estate space and provide a little bit more critical thinking on the more neutral space about what's going on. And if you do want to work with our team, whether it's for buying, selling, or investing, you can reach out to me and book a strategy call. It's over here. The link is right here. It's www.chatwithzen.com. Now, the next article we have over here, Trudeau's housing crisis fix is missing one key element: more workers to build homes. We talked about it in the previous article, right? So I had a couple things that are highlighted here. You can see over here it said, but Canada has already been building at the fastest pace in 7 decades with more than 20,000 apartments for rent or buy. And there's also a lot of condos being built. But the problem is we do have a labor shortage right here. And it takes a lot of time to fix. Like, if you guys don't understand how the immigration process works, it's actually really messed up. Like, even people with educations that come here, they can't use that education for anything, but then they're forced to do something else, right? We need to actually bring people in here who are really good at trades so that we can replace the retirement workforce that we're talking about previously, so that we can actually continue building. Because even if you speed up all this permits and you push all this development to go there, you still physically need the people to build these properties. And if you don't bring these people in, the demand for these skilled laborers are going to keep going up, right? Because it's a supply and demand, which means that it's going to push more cost onto the cost of building whatever the housing is, which therefore pushes that cost onto the buyer, which defeats the purpose of, you know, having affordable housing, because the cost side went up because the labor shortage is messing it all up. See, that's kind of like the cascading effect of what's happening and why we need a lot of skilled labor. So this is why they're calling out Justin Trudeau for bringing the wrong type of immigrants in this article, right? And the last thing I have here is the average person working the trades will make over 100 grand a year, and that's a pretty good job, but it's not something that everyone in our community thinks about as a career choice. And that's exactly what I was talking about earlier, right? I know a lot of people make a lot of money in the blue collar space, but people just think like, you know, they're like, oh, it's just a plumber. But plumbers make a ton of money, and there's a shortage of plumbers. I can tell you that. Like, if my kid wants to end up going to like trade school, yeah, go for it. You can make a lot of money from it. Like, I know plumbers who became contractors who actually opened a plumbing business, and they do very well because they're always in demand, right? So it's just absolutely wild, just like the thinking that we have, right? And then the other thing right here that they could ease off on the pricing is what we've always talked about: government taxes, levies, and all that stuff. Like, it makes up about 12 to 20% depending on the city you're building in, and that's a large chunk. If you just kind of take that component out and then you reduce the price, maybe it'll get passed on to the buyers, but at the same time, maybe the builders will keep it, right? So that's kind of the push and pull that I don't really have a comment on it, right? It's just kind of like, I wish it would be removed, but at the same time, if you don't have revenue from taxes, then at the same time, you don't have revenue for these services we have, right? Or maybe we just have a smaller government. Either or, right? That's kind of the thinking. Now, the last article we have here is, Ontario needs new housing, and whatever the party says, it won't come easy. And this is kind of where I stand in all this too, right? Like, same government, same results. These are all nice. They're going to do it. I think ultimately at the end of the problem, it's still not going to happen, right? So this article is calling out the Conservatives for saying, look, they haven't delivered anything in the last 4 years, and similar to what I'm thinking, I don't think anything's going to happen. These are all kind of nice to have, but they're not going to speed our way into housing crisis. Like I told you before, there's no silver bullet for any of this. It's just we all have to work at it, and over time, hopefully, it gets better. So this is a little push in the right direction, but it's not going to be the silver bullet that you think fixes everything. We have to have big reforms, and the big reform I'm thinking about is just like wiping out all of exclusionary zoning and just do it right on onset. But I don't think the PC government has enough, cojones to actually just do that, because I think all the cities are going to, nix them, right? Granted, they do have a majority, so they could do it to an extent. So last thing in this article that I've highlighted here is already something I've mentioned earlier in this video, which is the ending of exclusionary zoning. So they need to increase a lot of density right now for a lot of these high rises, which they're doing with the MZOs. But the problem still is that the city gets in the way, and you really got to end all the exclusionary zoning until you forbid the use of, detached neighborhoods staying as detached neighborhoods. All that land doesn't get used for increased density, and you get forced it into other areas. And because you force into other areas and you only can go high rise, it eliminates the type of housing that a lot of families need. And that's kind of ultimately what I think the problem is right now. So that's why I think the big thing that they can do right now, if they do have since they do have a majority government, is just to end exclusionary zoning and allow everyone for the upzone. But that's probably a political suicide, because no one's going to like it. Kind of like how they keep talking about removing adding a capital gains tax on the primary residence, but it's Don't just talk. No one wants to do it because it's political suicide. Anyways, hopefully this gives you kind of an idea of how I think about what's going to happen with the PSC taking over for another majority for 4 years. Personally, I just wouldn't rely on the government for getting anything done. They're very slow and methodical, and by the time something may get done, it's kind of like, way too late. My thinking on this is kind of like, the Vaughan subway was supposed to be done way longer ago, but it got delayed because of all the knickknacks and kind of red tape that gets caught. Same with Eglinton RLT, and I just apply that to basically anything that the government tries to do. Too little, too late, not fast enough. Now, I don't want to end this on a kind of very negative note, but like obviously from an investor perspective or people buying real estate, when you know that, the housing crisis is kind of a slow moving train wreck that they're trying to slowly steer away, you can get ahead of this by kind of owning good assets that pay for themselves. So if you're looking for kind of some real estate help, specifically on the buying and investing side, just so that you understand, because there probably is a housing crisis, there's a supply crisis, and I don't think these problems are being fixed by any of these solutions that are being proposed right now. You can get ahead of that curve and make some money in real estate investing. You can book a strategy call with me using the link right here. It's www.chatwithzen.com. Until next time, your move, your future. See ya. Now that you're done watching this one, how about this one? Oh, you know what? This one's good too. Ooh, this one's really good. You know what? Just watch them both.